Hey guys, Alex Sutherland here. You may know me from Card Runners as Ace Suth, and today I am bringing you a new strategy pack about blind versus blind post-flop play. I'm super excited about this video. I've actually been kind of working on this off and on for a few months before my imposition c-betting video, but I decided to release this one now after going through some of the more simple concepts that come up in imposition c-betting. So in this video, what I really want to focus on is that playing from out of position as the pre-flop raiser is just fundamentally different from in-position play, and there's a few reasons for this. The most fundamental difference is that a flop check does not let you see a turn card. When you check the flop, as the out of position player, you're often going to get bet at and you're often going to have to fold immediately after checking. And the impact of this is that your check range has to be a lot more balanced, because what we see with a lot of the GTO in-possession c-betting strategies that we looked at in my IP c-betting strategy pack was that they tended to follow a basic format where the in-position c-betting strategy is, bet 100% with your hand stronger than X, start mixing with some, set of hands between betting and checking that are kind of strength X down to Y, then check a whole bunch of medium hands, and then bet with bluffs mixed with hands kind of worse than Z. And they all kind of follow this pattern. And we were able to get away with still having a balanced range on a lot of turn cards by having really good board coverage with our check back range. So that, even if our check back range on the flop wasn't very nutty, we'd have the right kind of draws or the right kind of hands to hit trips or two pair in surprising ways, such that on all sorts of turns our range ended up very balanced. When you're out of position, you don't get that luxury of, having a range that isn't balanced on the flop but might become balanced with high frequency on lots of different turns. Your range needs to be balanced right now, because after you check, your opponent is going to have a lot of incentive to bet. And so because of this, as we're going to see, the entire shape of GTO c-betting ranges is significantly different. It's not going to be the case that you can always bet the nuts like you do in position. And there's going to be a whole bunch of other differences, but this is the most fundamental concept to get across, is just how different an out of position flop check is from an in position flop check. And not only is it more confusing, more complicated, trying to balance your range in this way takes a lot more thought. Most players also have less experience with it, and I'd say most players haven't actually carefully thought about the differences between OP and IP play. And that combination of, you have less experience with it just because you open the button so frequently, you get in the situation where it folds to you on the cutoff for button you get to open and you play against the big blind. That's one of the most frequent occurrences in poker where you get to see a flop. It's less common that it folds all the way to you in the small blind and you get to raise in the big blind. It's less common that you get to open the cutoff and get called by the button, just because of hand frequencies. A button might call a cutoff open, 10, 12% of the time, and even some of those times you'll get 3-bet, whereas when you open the button, the odds that you end up playing against the BB in a single raise pot is very high, 30, 40%. So, people haven't thought as hard about it. They also don't run into the situation at the tables quite as often. And because of that, I think that even pretty strong regulars in today's mid-stakes games, 2-4 through 5-10, pretty seriously misplay these spots on a regular basis. And that's exciting for us because it means that we can identify how to play these spots more correctly, how to exploit the kind of standard play that exists out there today. There is potential for significant payoff. Now, I was actually going to do all as one strategy pack, just combine all kind of out of position post-flop play into one strategy pack. So I was going to look at blind versus blind play, cutoff versus button play, under the gun versus button play, and kind of go through all that at once. And I actually decided to split this into two strategy packs and really focus on blind versus blind play in isolation for the first one. And the reason for this is because when you have these wider ranges that you run into with, the small blind raising the big blind, where both players have, 50% plus of hands, it's actually a lot easier to kind of see the patterns and similarities and key differences between various board types because the ranges are, pretty big and broad, and you have coverage on all sorts of boards. And there's not a huge difference between, a queen 7-2 and a jack 7-2 board with these ranges. When you're looking at something like an under the gun opening range versus a big blind flat range, the ranges are so tight and so small, and suddenly the difference between a queen high board and a jack high board is really different because under the gun has drastically more queens than jacks. When you're in that situation, it becomes a lot harder to understand what's happening that's due to fundamental out of position flop play, and what's happening because of nuances about how tight the ranges are, how important blocker effects are, how important the range is really not intersecting very much is. An under the gun range and a big blind flat range intersect a lot less than a small blind raising into big blind range do. So because of that, this video is just going to focus on blind versus blind play, because I think that's the first step to really let us get a good feel and good understanding for how out of position flop play in particular works. And then in my next strategy pack, I'm going to attempt to apply those principles and kind of extend them, see where they stay the same, see where they break down when we look at these tighter range cases that happens when you say raise under the gun and get called by the cutoff, stuff like that. Now, as I said, standard play at mid stakes is, we're going to see pretty weak and exploitable. One of the first examples I'm going to look at when we get into the actual GTO games here is noticing that when I worked with one of my students who plays 5-10 on stars, and we did our best to construct kind of what we thought was representative how most regulars would c-bet on an A7-5 rainbow board after 3xing from the small blind into the big blind and getting called. We found the c-betting range did worse than checking all the time and just not even trying to c-bet because it's too confusing. And that comparison is actually against a minimally exploitative opponent. And the reason that comes up is because, while obviously you're really, abandoning an important strategic option by not c-betting on A7-5, you are at least kind of preventing yourself from being exploited by, keeping your check-back range strong. And as we're going to see, the main weakness is a really weak check-back range that can often come up, especially in these ace-high boards. On some other boards, like a queen 10-2, what we thought was kind of standard c-betting is better than checking back all the time, but it's still a lot worse than GTO does in terms of strategy EV. Now, anytime I, do my theory, do my analysis, do my data, and come up with something that's really substantially different from, standard play, which is somewhat rare, but does come up, there's always a concern people have, I'd say, very reasonably, that is, well, how could it be possible that people have been playing this spot incorrectly for so long? How could that possibly persist? And I think that's a really valid question and definitely a great one to ask. What I'd like to kind of point out and cite as evidence here is that historically, throughout the evolution of poker, especially online poker, weak strategies have existed in the wild for surprisingly long periods of time. And, this is somewhat self-apparent. If you just measure the quality of play in today's games versus the quality of play in, say, 2010, or, even pre-Black Friday, the difference is enormous. And maybe the most simple example that I can think of is that if you were playing in, 2008, 2009, there was a lot of people playing like a 85 or 90% c-betting strategy on a whole bunch of boards, and their opponents were folding to c-betting, with such a frequency that it was probably profitable to c-bet your whole range. Even, the 85% was maybe even too low to be fully exploitative. And this didn't just persist for a few weeks, and it wasn't just a few players for doing this. It was, most players, at least up to 5-10, were playing this way for years. And there's actually it was almost like there was a weird tacit agreement where people would c-bet, would take turns c-betting and folding, and they'd say, oh, you get to be the folder now, and you get to lose your money. And I remember pretty clearly when I was coming up the ranks, I got some coaching because I was having trouble from moving from 1-2 to 2-4 on stars. And my coach was basically just started sweating me and was just like, oh, you actually play really well. You just need to c-bet more. And he was just having me c-bet in all these spots where it didn't make any sense to me that you could possibly c-bet there. And sure enough, people were just folding. And I'd say that kind of, drastic over c-betting and drastic over folding to c-betting persisted in the kind of poker meta for at least a year, maybe two. And there's been all sorts of other examples of this gradual evolutions of the game. And I think that, like I said, because the blind versus blind play is a lot more complicated and because it doesn't come up as often, that it's not at all far-fetched to imagine that there'd be some significant weaknesses that haven't actually been addressed yet in blind versus blind play. And that's what makes this video so exciting to me. That's why I've worked so hard on it, is because having a chance to spot those weaknesses and take the lead on identifying and correcting them is a really exciting opportunity, hopefully for you guys too. So that's what we've got on our plate today. Let's get into it.